Hello, poetry lovers. The video tonight shows the creation of a new part of a long free verse poem. Stick around to the end of the video to see the complete first draft. I had the idea for this long poem last summer, and I've been slowly working on it since then. The poem is called Thalassophobia, which means the fear of deep water. In this poem, I'm writing several long sections that all tell slightly different stories, joined together in one long piece, with each section as its own numbered stanza. On this day, I sat down to write the third section I'd brainstormed. Although I'd been thinking about this poem for a while, and although I started writing fairly quickly, I paused frequently as I wrote the first few lines. In general, this poem deals with difficult topics, and this one was one of the hardest ones. So it took me a few minutes to get started, but once I did, the words started moving much more quickly. This topic was hard to write about, partly because it's so close to home for me. If you follow news regarding evangelical churches in America, you're probably familiar with the scandal that broke a few years ago regarding sex abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the largest evangelical denominations. Because I had attended SBC churches for a long time, this was a distressing revelation, and ultimately it has had huge personal repercussions for me, even though I'm not personally connected to any of the victims this poem references. My stance against the actions of the SBC has been a huge factor in loss of community and relationships in the past year for me. But despite these personal losses, I still consider it my moral duty to speak out on this issue. I have no platform but this one, and no voice except my poetry, so this is what I'm using. Though I ran into a few difficult moments, I wrote steadily toward the end of this section, building an analogy. An analogy is an extended comparison in which one complex thing is used to illuminate another complex idea. In this piece, I create an analogy that compares the corruption and immorality in the SBC with a deep ocean, and I metaphorically place myself floating on top of this ocean. I wanted, through this visual, to convey a couple conflicting ideas. My own safety in a context of real danger, my own awareness in a context of truth that is not knowable. The whole poem is built on and revolves around images and analogies like this, which I'm using to show the complexity and fear in the different topics I'm exploring. As I finished this section, I paused slowly and read back through the whole thing. I felt uncertain and uncomfortable with this one, and I was looking for evidence that my discomfort was related to a misstep I made in writing. But as I was reviewing, I became more convinced that my discomfort was just about writing on this issue at all. It's hard and scary to challenge the actions of leaders in our culture, but I'm convinced that this one is one of the most important functions of poetry. Historically, poetry has been used to investigate, unveil, and protest. Poets have been known as the prophets of their societies, and even though I have a small voice, and even though others may have already spoken louder, more incisively, and better on this issue, I realized as I glanced back over my words that it's my responsibility too, even if nothing ever comes from it. A poet should write what is true, even if nobody will ever read it. This section was hard, but I think the poem needs it. I'll be sharing all three sections of Thalassophobia that I've completed thus far, but this is the first draft of Thalassophobia Section 3, written in about 15 minutes on February 11th, 2024. Thalassophobia. 1. It was summer's hottest day. We all, church kids, had gathered at someone's muddy pond. Lake. The water stretched wide enough that shouts on one side were silenced before making shore. Each bank grew thick with reeds. There were a few dry trees. Some of us waded, canoed. Some, just me, stayed ashore, my two-piece named Too Skimpy by our leader. One boy, nobody now recalls his name or who invited him, one new boy swam far out. In the deep, lake weed grew thick and gripped his treading feet, clinging and dragging. He went under. And again. Nobody heard his gasping except one of ours, a gorgeous girl, who swam to him. He gripped her. used her head, her shoulders as buoys, pushing her down to raise himself. And again. Someone saw their struggle. We ran for help. A man dove to save them as she, half drowned, dunked and held under. After, he and she, stranger and savior, rested inside, slowly drying. She was still shaking. He thanked her for rescue, nearly her end. He praised her. His hand groped her knee, her thigh. When I came inside, he receded, but her eyes were deep and wide. She was still shaking. 2. He says he has it. Fear of deep water. We're contemplating a cruise, and he confesses this terror. Not drowning, ship sinking, just the fear of sea itself, of land drowned thousands down. I think of flying, New York to Frankfurt, seeing far below the bright surface prickled with waves, those unbroken miles. Water where live who knows what lives. Is it fear only of what teems unspeakably there, or fear of the unbroken deep, unfluttered fathoms where light despairs and even the eyeless falter? Fear of distance to surface, of the dark salt blank, the vast, the sunless, the oblivious void. He says he has it. 3. 2022. Spring or summer, I read the news. 700 victims, 700 known victims, and 20 years of Baptists hiding their abusers. I read and felt the anger that is fear. I spent my life straddling a buoy of truth atop a misogynist sea, believing without understanding my body was not death, not sin, my being not lesser, weaker, wronger than the men who led me, believing their words and doubting only their actions. Until I knew, and I looked down. The water all around, vermilion as a lake of fire with light of a tired sun. The fathoms multiplied beneath my floating feet. I could not conceive what eyeless evil crawled in those dark waters. I could see no floor, only my daughter paddling on the surface of a lake Hades deep. Thanks for watching this episode of Ars Poeticat. If you liked watching poetry happen, please like and subscribe. Then go make some art.